What's going on, guys? Aero here, and guys, today I want to talk to you a little bit more about the release date for Pokemon on the Nintendo Switch. Now, if you guys have been watching my videos for a while, then I'm sure a lot of you know that I'm a huge believer of Pokemon Switch releasing next year in 2019. So every time I upload a new video about Pokemon Switch, I get a bunch of you guys who comment saying that the game is coming out this year and there's no way that it's coming out next year. And I think a lot of you guys don't know exactly why I believe that the game is coming out next year. I think some of you just think that because of how last year at E3 when we got the announcement from the president of the Pokemon company and how he stated that Game Freak is developing a core RPG Pokemon title that may not release for more than a year, I think a lot of you guys just assume that because he said more than a year, then that means Aero is just instantly thinking that the game is coming out next year. So in this video, I'm going to try to give you guys a good idea of why I think that Pokemon Switch is coming out next year. I'm going to try to make you guys see all of the reasons as to why I think it makes the most sense for having Pokemon Switch released next year. Now before we get started, something pretty funny that I just want to mention real fast is that the Pokemon company actually loves to prove me wrong. And I posted about this on Twitter a few days ago, but last year if you were subscribed to this channel, then you know that around June, I think like the first or second day of June, I posted a video talking about why I think Pokemon needs to come onto the Nintendo Switch. And this was before E3, this was before we had the Pokemon Switch announcement or anything like that. I think the actual date I posted it was June 4th. So I posted that video on June 4th talking about why Pokemon should come onto the Nintendo Switch. And literally 2 days after I posted that video, we got a Pokemon Direct where they announced that the next new Pokemon games were going to be coming onto the 3DS. So I just find it funny how in that video I was talking so much about why it makes a lot of sense to have Pokemon come out on the Switch and why it needs to happen and why it's going to be so good for both the Pokemon company and Nintendo, and then we just had that Pokemon Direct where they're like, no, we're still going to stick to the 3DS and have Pokemon Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon. So yeah, this video is going to be about why I think that Pokemon Switch is going to be releasing next year in 2019, and let's see if the Pokemon company proves me wrong again by having Pokemon Switch come out this year in 2018. I think it would be really funny if they had a Pokemon Direct that happened just a few days from this video, and they did the same thing from last year, but they just proved me wrong and announced Pokemon Switch for this year in 2018. We'll just have to wait and see what happens, but anyways, let's get started. Now, I think that the really important thing that helps you to determine when we can expect Pokemon Switch to come out is exactly when they began the development for this game. And here's the thing, we actually don't have any official confirmation about when the development began for Pokemon Switch, and so we can't determine when we think that the game is coming out. I mean, I know in Nintendo's document it says the game is slated for 2018 or later, so we know it has to come out between then. But the thing is, we don't know when the development started to give us an idea of when we could expect the game to be finished and ready. So yeah, there is no official source for when Pokemon Switch's development began, and I think that's the thing that people need to understand, because I know so many times I get comments of people saying, well, you do realize that Pokemon Switch has been in development since 2015, and that's just not true because there is no official source out there that said that. There's no interview with any of the Pokemon developers, Game Freak hasn't confirmed it, the Pokemon company hasn't confirmed it, Nintendo hasn't confirmed it, no one has told us exactly when they started development for Pokemon Switch, and so you kind of need to make an assumption on when you think it started. So I think that many people just assume that Pokemon Switch's development started in 2015 because of how we didn't get any main series Pokemon game in 2015. I think that the only game that we got that year was Mystery Dungeon, and I think at that time we still didn't know anything about the Nintendo Switch and it was still codenamed NX, so I think people just thought, like, because of how we didn't know anything about the Switch, because of how Nintendo was developing the system, obviously Nintendo gave Game Freak some early dev kits for the system and they started developing Pokemon Switch, that's why we didn't get any main series Pokemon game. And while that could be the case, there's always a possibility, I just don't think that that's what happened. I feel like they were still hard at work developing Pokemon Sun and Moon. Now, if we did get an official confirmation from the Pokemon company as to when the development for Pokemon Switch started, like if they confirmed in an interview that Pokemon Switch's development started in 2015, then I think that there would be a good chance for the game to come out this year. But because of how there is no official source for when the development started for Pokemon Switch, we're gonna have to make an assumption for when we think it did. So that's what I did. I created an assumption for when I think that Pokemon Switch's development started, but it wasn't just like some random time that I think it started. I actually carefully looked into interviews with Game Freak's developers, and based off of what they said, I was able to create an assumption for when I think Pokemon Switch's development started. And based off of all of that, I think that Pokemon Switch's development started somewhere in the second half of 2016. So let me explain to you guys why I think that's when the development started for Pokemon Switch. So the first thing that you need to understand is that the development team at Game Freak is actually pretty small. They don't have a ton of people to help them develop Pokemon games, and I think the last time I checked they had around 150 or so people. Now with a pretty small team like that and creating an extremely successful franchise like Pokemon, it definitely takes a pretty long time to develop the games. Now here's a quote that I want to share with you guys from an interview that GameSpot got to have with Mr. Masuda back in 2016 when Pokemon Sun and Moon were about to come out. And also all of these interviews that I am going to be talking about will be linked in the descriptions. If you want to go and check it out and read the full interview, you can do that as well. But yeah, GameSpot asked Mr. Masuda, thinking about the games themselves, in America especially, we see a lot of yearly franchises. Every year there's a new Call of Duty game, but for Pokemon, how does the team decide how much time they need for a new game? How do you decide when it's finally ready? And Mr. Masuda replied saying, it really needs to be something that we as a team are satisfied with, but it does kind of fall into a cycle. An all new generation game takes about 3 years of development to really get it to a point where we know it's something that people will enjoy. Even with Pokemon Sun and Moon, we had a team of around 120 people, but it still took us about 3 years. So you can see right there, with the team that Game Freak has, it took them 120 people and it still took them like 3 years just to develop Pokemon Sun and Moon. Now we don't know exactly what Pokemon Switch is going to be, but I think it's pretty safe to assume that it's going to be the next new generation with an all new region and some all new Pokemon. And the reason that I'm saying that is because of how this game is going to be on a new system, being the Nintendo Switch. It's safe to assume that it's probably going to be the next generation, as every time Pokemon has been made for a new system, the first games that are always on that new system are always a new generation. I mean, just take a look at the first Pokemon games on every single new system. Game Boy Advance, new generation. DS, new generation. 3DS, new generation. So I think it's pretty safe to assume that for the Nintendo Switch, the first games are going to be a brand new generation of Pokemon. And so you saw there in that quote from Mr. Masuda that when they were developing Pokemon Sun and Moon, they had around 120 people to help them make that game. And they did talk about in another interview that happened last year that whenever they have a brand new generation of Pokemon coming out, that's usually when they have the full squad at Game Freak working on the new games. Now in another interview, they talked about how they usually have a bunch of people from Game Freak working on a game that's going to be the next new generation, but then after that they actually split the team up. So here's another GameSpot interview with Mr. Omori and Mr. Kazumasa Iwao last year right before the release of Pokemon Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon. Now in that interview, Mr. Omori stated, of course we have a limited number of staff available to us, but we also have a very unique staff within the company. We have younger members and also veterans who have been working on this series for a long time, very technically gifted staff members. We want to use these staff in the best way possible. For example, this time around with Pokemon Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, we can treat it as a main project for our younger staff to work on to grow and develop their skills, while perhaps the more veteran and established members of the company can work on the upcoming Switch project. That's the type of approach that we often take, having a growth-based project for our younger staff members and then a new project for our existing veterans. Using this project management style ensures that a lot of our projects have a positive effect on one way as they go. Now in an IGN interview with these same two developers, Mr. Kazumasa Iwao explained that the development team for Pokemon Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon is around 80 members. And so he explained how this is pretty much half the number of people that they had working when Pokemon Sun and Moon were originally coming out in 2016. So you can see right here that the development at Game Freak is that they pretty much have everyone working whenever there's a new generation that's coming out. But once they're done with that new generation, they split the team up so that they have the veterans start working and planning on the next new generation, but they have the younger members work on the games like Pokemon Emerald, Pokemon Platinum, and Pokemon Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon. And so because of this, I think that the development for Pokemon Sun and Moon probably wrapped up somewhere around the second half of 2016. And at that time, that's when the younger developers like Mr. Kazumasa Iwao were able to start working on Pokemon Ultra Sun and Moon, but the veteran developers like Mr. Masuda and Mr. Morimoto were able to start planning for Pokemon on the Nintendo Switch. And then last year when the development wrapped up for Pokemon Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, that's when the younger developers were also able to join the veterans and help them start working on Pokemon Switch. So it all lines up here. You can see that even Mr. Masuda explained that it takes around 3 years for them to create an all new generation, and considering how Gen 7 came out in 2016, that would explain that it takes around 3 years to create Gen 8, which is going to be for Pokemon on the Nintendo Switch, and that's probably going to be a new generation because it's on a new system. And speaking of how Pokemon Switch is going to be on a brand new system, I think that's also another thing that people need to understand as to why I think that Pokemon Switch is going to be coming out next year in 2019. So even when Pokemon Sun and Moon were coming out, it still took them around 3 years to develop, and that was them developing on the 3DS, which is a system that they already had 2 games that came out before it. They already had Pokemon X and Y, and then they already had Pokemon Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, and it still took them 3 years to develop Pokemon Sun and Moon, even though that they were already used to the 3DS system. And with the Nintendo Switch, this is going to be an all new system. They're going to be working with HD for the first time, and I'm not a developer so I can't tell you how exactly this works, but I can assure you that there's definitely some new things that I'm sure the developers had to learn with working with the Nintendo Switch. It's not something so simple that you can just move right from developing on the 3DS to developing on the Nintendo Switch. There's definitely a lot of things that I'm sure the developers even had to learn. Like, I think some people just think it's pretty simple, like if you were writing with a pencil and I gave you a pen to write with instead. Like, it's not something like that. It's so simple to do. I think there's still a lot of stuff that they had to learn. I'm sure there's new techniques that they had to learn in developing games as well. So I think because of that, it explains why they would probably need to take another year to make sure that the game is as best as it could be. Now, it's definitely not impossible to have Pokemon Switch released this year, but I think just because of how they explain how the developers work at Game Freak with like the younger staff and then the veteran staff, and how even Mr. Masuda explained that it takes them typically around 3 years to develop an all new generation, if Pokemon Switch is going to have Gen 8, which it most likely will, then I think it makes the most sense to have that game released next year. I just don't see them being able to create an all new region, a new original story, new Pokemon, new towns, new items, new moves, new abilities, new characters, new music, and have that all be ready on a brand new system that they probably never developed for in 2018. Of course, it's not impossible, and kudos to them if they can actually do it and make it release this year, but I think just because of how all of this is like, I just think it's most likely going to come out next year. And so there you go guys, those are all the reasons that I have as to why I think that Pokemon on the Nintendo Switch is going to release next year in 2019. Definitely be sure to click that like button if you guys enjoyed this video, and also comment down below and let me know how you feel about this. Do you agree with me, and can you see where I'm coming from as to why I think that the Pokemon Switch game is coming out next year? But also let me know if you disagree with me and comment some of your points as to why you think that the game could come out this year. I would love to discuss with you guys, and I think that there's a lot of fun in discussing the possibility of when the game is going to come out. I just won't reply to you if you comment something stupid like, Aero, you dumb idiot, obviously the game is coming out this year. If you're new to this channel, then please be sure to subscribe. I'm definitely going to have some more Pokemon content in the future, so be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on that. Click on that bell to become a part of the notification squad, and go follow me on Twitter at @ActualAero. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Thank you so much for watching.